Good afternoon. Is it still good morning or is it good afternoon? It's right now. It is right now. It is 12 o'clock. Hey, welcome. Thanks for coming today. Glad to have all of you. My name is David Bowling, director of the Launch Fisher. So I started to say the Indiana IoT Lab, but we're at Launch Fisher. So I'm glad you're here. This is exciting for us. Not only are we kicking off our first of four here in this series for podcasting, but we wanted the opening this up, and I wanted to share with you guys. Rachel, myself, Rachel in the back, Rachel Drake, our director for events and communications and marketing. But we put together anything that you'll see now from us is going to be kind of under this title of Learn at Launch. So I hope that you're recognizing that, and we start doing things. They'll be titled that way. And now we're starting with our new partnership and our new sponsor, Share Your Genius, on this podcasting series that we're going to undertake. So I hope that you guys are ready to come in and learn about podcasting. I'm just curious, and I hope that Rachel doesn't get upset when I ask this question. By show of hands, how many are currently doing podcasts or doing one on their own? Or have done one? Awesome. So pretty cool. So we're here to kick off this first one. Rachel has I'm going to introduce Rachel here in a second, but we're doing a series of four here with our new sponsor in the Share Your Genius team. But I just wanted to give you, as I'm looking here at my notes, so just put this kind of in memory mind bank here. But we're going to do, so this was the first one here, starting a podcast. In December, we will have another one. This is going to be demoing our podcast studio. For those of you that aren't members, we have our own podcast studio here and recording studio. So we'll want you guys to come back in December to check that space out as well. Rachel will be giving you guys a tour of that and kind of the assets that we have back there and how to use that. And then we'll roll into March. This will be recording your first podcast, how to make a great episode, both content and quality. And then in June, we'll be doing another one, our final one, on attracting the right audience and how to grow your show with distribution in mind. So the thought is thinking, how do we just keep working on this and growing your podcast? So glad you're all here. I'm sure this is going to be an awesome, good spend of 1 hour of time. So I'm going to hand the microphone over to Rachel Downey and have her come up and start talking to us and educating us on our podcast and how to use that and integrate that into our businesses. So Rachel, come on up. I'm excited, and I'm going to get over here and find a seat, and I have pen in hand and ready to go. So welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Bueller? Ha. Only certain people get that joke. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for joining today. He kind of stole my one-liner, which was, how many of you already have a podcast? No, I'm joking. So that's really helpful. What I want to make sure that I communicate just proactively is I don't want this to feel like me speaking at you for 45 minutes to an hour. So if you have questions as we go through, please just ask them organically. And then I will save space for more specific questions. But I just want to invite this up as this is very conversational, and I just want you to get the value out of this as much as possible. But I'm going to walk you through sort of kind of three primary parts. And the first thing I want to talk about is how to think about a podcast. Because a lot of times I think we live in a world where everyone's kind of doing one, or so it seems. And so you just kind of think you should do it, but you don't actually know why. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on helping you understand why you might consider doing a podcast. And we are saying podcast, but I also have to call out the elephant in the room. When I say podcast, what I mean is a show. I mean, it's video, it's audio. It's not just an audio file that lives in Apple Podcasts. There's a time and place for that, transparently, but I'm coming from how do we use podcasting as part of a business strategy, not just a tactic or a hobby. So just level setting from that. You can have it as a hobby, that's cool. This will be helpful for that too. But I just like to level set some of that. So if that's cool, we can get into it. Okay. My one-liner is always, it's never just a podcast. So we're going to start with why it's never just a podcast. And that comes back to the why you might consider doing one. So when I think about how businesses make decisions when it comes to just really, frankly, prioritizing what to do and when to do it. And I think about marketing specifically, there's usually like one or all three of these things are usually relevant, but one of them is taking the throne, like in terms of your priority. And so there's build brand, which is really around establishing authority. I've got it on here, but enhancing your credibility, just like getting yourself out there so that when people say the name of your company, people might know that you exist. The other one is driving demand. And driving demand is really comes down to pipeline. We need to grow revenue right now, and we need to get more people to show us loyalty. And drive demand could be net new, but it could also be driving demand with your existing client base. So you can think about it as more than just net new kind of logo or pipeline. And then grow an audience is you're expanding your reach. It's time to foster that community. It's time to just get more people talking and engaging with you. And so those are kind of the three things that I always like to level set on. And then I get to ask the question, which one matters most to you right now? And it can change. So this season, it might be drive demand. Next season, it might be, yeah, we got to build brand because we're launching this new product that nobody knows about. It could be we need to grow an audience because we've cultivated a little bit of a fandom, but we need it to grow our reach. And so your strategy actually can change based on what the primary outcome needs to be. So when you ask yourself the question of, I think I want to do a podcast, I always say, okay, but why? And if you can't answer that, you might just pause and decide. The fourth priority that's not on here, but the fourth priority that you might consider, like how a show might be strategic for you, is recruiting and retention. So you might want to have a show that helps with that. So that's more of like an employee engagement type of vibe. It might be one of those things that just allows you to capture your company story in a way that like perpetuates it into the future. But that's like a fourth kind of circle, if you will, when you start to think, is podcasting right for me? So hopefully that framing is helpful. Any questions pop up before I keep moving? Okay. All right, I put this on here, but I've got a cheat sheet here. So the other reason why we say it's never just a podcast is because it's so much more than just a podcast, and it can be. There's a couple principles here that we can talk about on how do you make sure this actually happens for you. But a podcast is one of those things that if you do it once, you can use it 1,000,000 times. And what I don't mean, and this is sort of the world that I live in terms of like what I read and consume on LinkedIn specifically. So if I'm saying something that's net new, cool, or if you want to roll your eyes, that's fine too. But you do see a lot of chatter online of like repurpose, repurpose, repurpose. And it's like, yes, but one podcast episode, while it can be turned into 1,000,000 things, like this little graphic shows you, it is not repurposed like peanut butter spread. You have to actually repurpose it on purpose based on the channel that you're distributing it on. And so when we think about why you're starting a podcast, what that long form is going to be, you can also design it based on the distribution channels that you're trying to maximize for. So as an example, you could say, I need to use my CEO. I need to get my CEO on the microphone. I need to create really good content because we need to build our brand. But I also have my sales team in my ear asking for content all of the time. But I don't want to create that content. They have questions that their prospects need answered, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you know what you can do is you can maximize that recording session, one for your episode, like your show, and you can also save like 15 minutes and just get those questions answered from your customers. And you can use that. So you can maximize this one asset into so many things. The other thing that you can think about there is when we talk about distribution for design, a lot of shows, and for those that have podcasts, how many of you have like segments on your show? So you could design a segment, which is like a piece of the show for a channel specifically. So you could say, I want to grow my audience with Gen Z buyers. Or Gen Z talent. I want them to pay attention to my brand. I need to be on TikTok because that's where they're engaging the most. We know that, right? So this segment is going to be a TikTok first segment so that when my team takes it and edits it and repurposes it, they're doing it on purpose. And so we're going to design that segment on purpose to be used for TikTok. It makes the final cut of your long form, but you already have the distribution in mind so that you're creating content for the channel you're going to distribute across. So This is the why. And I am very bullish on podcasting specifically because there is no other medium that allows you to do so much from one focused effort. So if you are somebody who's like, I need content and I need to do it well. And by the way, AI is a thing, and AI cannot create you. But what you can do is use it really smart, but from starting from a place of authenticity, which is you, which is your podcast. So I'm very, like I said, bullish on podcasting because of all it can do. But hopefully this visual is helpful as you start to think about what all you can be maximizing with your podcast. Any questions there? Or comments? Okay. Last thing I'll say before we kind of shift into kind of questions to get your mind thinking about your own strategy is in podcasting, there is what I would call like unintended consequences. So the reason it's never just a podcast is kind of a two-legged stool, if you will, if a stool has two legs. But one would be that you can maximize it like crazy, like there's nothing better. But the other is there's these unintended consequences that you just never knew would happen. So Tim, I'm going to call on Tim for a second. I will share the story, but you can edit me. But Tim and I were literally just talking before this, before we started talking, and was sharing a little bit of an unintended consequence of one of the shows that he launched 3 years ago, 5 years ago. Okay, I forget, COVID life still happened there. Okay, so 5 years ago, Tim and I did a show together. He had a podcast called Scaling Software. He had the CEO of, the guest. CEO of Replit on the show 5 years ago. Turns out this brand is the brand now because they were able to essentially take generative AI and now they can create apps like on the fly. This guy is having his moment, his day in the sun, the CEO. That conversation was 5 years ago. Now he has access to that guy's entire early days journey. It's like a little bit of a time capsule. And it's one of those things that now Tim gets to point back to, I have built this relationship with someone 5 years ago. I have a conversation with him. It gives him credibility as a CMO, as a marketer. And then it also allows us to show like the power of when you keep doing something consistently, you're gonna build a library. And you never know the stories that you capture today, what those stories are gonna do for you tomorrow. So it's one of those things where I'm like, so many people feel potentially intimidated by doing a podcast because it's video, because it's audio, because you're putting yourself out there. It takes courage to get on a microphone, no matter if it's something you're comfortable with or you're not. It takes courage. But the truth of it is like when you press play, when you do it, you are going to have so many unintended consequences that are going to bless you in so many ways. The other thing that I've heard from people before, and this is very recently, we had a client who said to us, nothing in our marketing is working right now to get new deals, to get new conversations with people that we need to build a relationship with, except for our podcast. Because you're asking somebody to join you on your show and you're actually exchanging value. They get value because they get to articulate their point of view, they get to practice their message. They get content, by the way, that little engine that could, they get that too. And then you get the opportunity to build a relationship with them. So if you do nothing, then just have a conversation with people that you need to buy, that can buy from you or build a relationship with you, that's the sole reason you should have a podcast. And it's not like a bait and switch thing. You should not use it as an opportunity to plug your business before they hang up. But it's truly like the way we buy has been the way we buy forever, which is through relationship. And the only way to start a relationship is to start a conversation. And your podcast creates that bridge. And then you get all the content goodness out of it. So there's a lot of those like kind of unintended consequences, I would say. I am curious, I'll pause. Does anybody that has a show or has had a show before have any of those unintended consequences happen? Yeah, bad vibes. Yeah. Yeah, it gives you a purpose. It gives you focus. And so, and I think that's, does anybody else have a story they want to share before because you teed me up beautifully, but I can share a story. You want to share? Are you sure? I don't have a story. Okay, well, we're going to come back to you. Yeah. Well, like, so Share Your Genius, we're obviously a company, but our mission is to foster human connection. And I'm like, this does it, because even if it's just one-to-one, you are literally having that human connection that you can't get anywhere else. In person or virtual, it still works. But one of the things that you said that was so beautiful, that kind of was like transitioning me, is when you start to think about the strategies of why you need to start a podcast. One of the questions that you need to ask yourself is um, how do you hope to realize it's never just a podcast, and like what is it that you need to do to take the steps forward. And basically my whole point in all of that, and you transitioned me well, and then I got distracted. By my fault, not your fault. I'm not calling you out. But it really is, if nothing else, you can say, I'm using this as an opportunity to give somebody purpose. And so when you start to think about answering the questions that I'm gonna tee up for you, I really do want you to think about the premise of your show. The premise or the purpose. What is the promise that you're giving your audience when they press play? Because even if you're using the show to just generate conversation, you're going to use it for all the glory that you can get out of it, you still have to deliver on a promise to somebody who's listening. And so it has to go beyond just what do I get out of this conversation, to your point, but what value am I bringing to my audience, to my listeners? And that can be aligned with your brand values. That can be aligned with something you're just frankly curious about. Like, there's so many ways that you can shape that premise. One of a client that we worked with before, she was a brand new marketer, coming into a brand new industry. She knew nothing about the field that she was going into. I think it was like cybersecurity or something like that, super potentially complex. And she's like, we need content, and I have to be in charge of creating it, and I know zero about this topic. So you know what she did? She started a podcast where she interviewed all these people who know everything about it, and it gave her an opportunity to be super curious. So the content was exceptionally authentic. And she was asking all of the questions that she needed the answer to. But oh, by the way, so does everybody else. And so she had an opportunity to create amazing content just because she was able to stay curious. And so it's kind of one of those things where it's like, let your pain shape your purpose. And the other way that I think about that too, it's like when we all got into business, no matter what role you're playing in business, but you typically stay in the field or the role that you're in because you're falling in love with the problem that you hope to solve. Your show can be part of that journey of what you're hoping to solve, whether it's like you want to learn more about it because you're hungry for that, whether you need to just get smarter about a topic, or whatever. When I got into podcasting, my actual pain was that I just had a daughter, my daughter, who's now 8 years old. She had been born 3 months early. And I found myself sitting at the NICU hospital, and I was in law school at the time. And I was like, oh shit, I got to figure out what my life's going to look like. And I got to figure out how to make money because I got a kid in the NICU and I don't know what her life's going to look like. And so that was sort of the pain that I was in. Serendipitously, one of my friends at the time, he reached out to me and he's like, hey, I'm launching this podcast. Will you help me? And I was like, well, what are you launching a podcast for? Like, what is a podcast? What's happening? And he's like, I'm starting a brand new company, and I'm going to use this podcast as an opportunity to interview these VPs of sales, so that I can learn from them, build my brand awareness, and create content. And I was like, time out, that's cool. Let me help you do that. And then what it ended up happening is that his company, within, I want to say like 6 to 9 months, it was already like a 6-figure business, because he had generated these relationships, meaningful human connection. And then it solved my pain because I was able to make, $25 an hour at 3 a.m. While my kid was asleep in the NICU. And so it's one of those things where it's like, if you can figure out how to maximize your expertise to help you solve your real business problems, this is literally the vehicle to do it. And so the last thing I'll say, and then we'll actually start asking you some of these questions, and I'd love for you to jot them down if it's helpful for you. Last thing I'll say is, in the world we live in, I think everyone has heard the phrase, well, everybody has a podcast. How many of you have heard that? Everybody already has a podcast. Everybody's creating a podcast. Why would I create a podcast? Blah, blah, blah. It's not true, okay? There are, I think the numbers today are just like shy of 10 million podcasts in the world. When I started the company, it was like less than a million, which is kind of weird to think about, just the growth, just in terms of the adoption. But there's like a little bit less than 10. There's still like 500 or 600 million blogs out in the world. You're good. I promise you. You're not butting up against anybody. And out of those, let's call it 10 million, just to be generous, out of those 10 million podcasts, I think only like 30% of them are active. And what I mean by active, I mean they've published in the last 90 days. And so it is still a blue ocean, is my point. And there's no other medium, and I know this isn't convince me to do a podcast session, but I just have to say it. There is still no other medium that allows you to compete with the big boys and girls. You can go up against Netflix. You can go up against, maybe not Joe Rogan, but you can go up against some of the big brands in a way that feels way more impactful because you have access to people that you never would have had access to otherwise. And so my whole point is just to say, like, of all the channels in the world, why a podcast? Those are a lot of the reasons why you might consider a podcast. And so my challenge to you as you start to think about strategy and like, what would I do if I were starting from zero to actually start a podcast, is I would ask that question of, how do you hope to realize how it's never just a podcast? And it could be touchy-feely. It could be, I want to learn from 3 people. I want to get 3 influential people that are in my industry that have that voice and that pull. I want 3 of them to say yes to coming on my show because it's going to give my brand so much credibility. I want to create a content waterfall. Our company has no consistent messaging. We have no consistent programming on our content. I'm going to use my show to do that. Those are just some of the ways that you could think about that. Any questions or thoughts here? Okay, we'll keep her moving. Let's talk about success. So this is one of the things that podcasting, I think all marketing kind of gets this, but it's like, well, what's the ROI? How do I know it's worth it? The truth of it is, I have said a lot around sales and relationship and pipeline, but I would not consider podcasting your performance marketing like thing. I just would not. And what I mean by that specifically is, like, I would not go back to my CEO or myself if I'm the decision maker and say, you're going to generate like money from this within 3 months. You're going to generate money within 30 days. It's not going to happen. It might. Okay, that would be an unintended consequence, not a expected. So when you start to think about like that success, like what do you want to define? I would think about it a little bit in the softer realm. Are people talking to us more? Are people engaging with our content more? If my primary channel of distribution is LinkedIn, is it popping off more? Like, are people liking my stuff? Are they sharing my stuff? Those kinds of things. Have I been able to talk to my customers? Have I been able to talk to my customers more than I would have a year ago if I didn't have this podcast? So one of your like the reason that answering that question matters is because it'll help you define the strategy that you deploy. So for example, that idea of going, I want to talk to, if I have 15 customers, I want to talk to 10 of them this year. And I want to learn them better. I want to know what they care about. I want to innovate because my customers are the things that matters the most to me. My show is going to be a vehicle for us intentionally meeting, me getting to know them on a deeper level, and then also just creating that stickier kind of relationship. Then your entire show strategy needs to be serving that customer and creating an opportunity for you guys to engage in that way. It's not a commercial, but it's an opportunity for you to just engage in that way. So a good example for that was, we work with a company that's a healthcare IT leadership company. I don't know if anyone else is in that industry here, but it could be kind of boring, like, just saying. So it's like, what kind of show do you create that's like not boring? Yes, you can go outside the box, you can go crazy, you can spend $1 million and we can create a really cool documentary and we can go get influencers and do all those things. Or you can tell me what your problem is, which is, I need to talk to my customers more because I don't know what they care about anymore. My CEO's too busy, he can't get in the room with them anymore, and he's just busy and I don't know what to do. Okay, we're gonna create a show that allows your CEO to have space to intentionally help the marketing team create content and connect with their clients, their customers. And the show has nothing to do with healthcare IT. It has everything to do with, what does your son like to do? You know what I mean? What's your hobby on the weekend? What do you think about tomatoes? Like, it doesn't matter. It's like, how do I just like learn who you are as a human being? And then we get the benefit of showing our CEO in a very human light. We create deeper connection because I know what your son's hobby is now, and we can talk about that because, oh, my son loves that too. You just get those opportunities to kind of get back to what matters most, which is that relationship. And so my whole point here is going, when you think about defining success, play out the story you want to tell to yourself, to your CEO, to your CMO, whatever it is. Literally write it. Hey, in 6 months from now, we're going to have had 6 conversations with influencers who are going to share our show to expand our reach. And as a result, our website traffic is going to go up, our social sharing is going to go up, and we're going to have somebody in our DMs telling us how awesome we are. Write that story. And then when you write that story, you can't help just but build the show that allows you to make that happen. Talked about build brand, drive demand, grow audience. That recruiting retention, internal comms is a big reason why you might also consider just using the vehicle. Because as things change, and if you're in tech, if you're in business, if you live today, change is happening so fast that it's hard to keep up with it. And as a leader of an organization, it's your job to keep clarity more than certainty, right? And so it's like, how do you communicate clarity? Well, you have to communicate it. And so having a vehicle to do that, it could be a success story. I need to be able to tell my people what's up, you know what I mean? So that they're not worried about something that we can't control. So those are some of the other reasons that you might consider thinking about a show as a vehicle. And the other thing I'll say, and this is potentially bad advice because it goes against first principles in marketing, but it's true. When you think about your show, you need a solid premise that conveys a point of view, right? That like lets people know what they're getting into. However, your show is also a channel. And so if you think about your show as a channel, you can have different types of content on your channel for different purposes. So I like to think about it like you are TBS. You are now TBS, you have a channel. I have my Tuesday morning programming, I have my Thursday night programming. You can play with your channel in that way. So more specifically what I mean by that is you might have an episode that's 5 minutes from the CEO. What headlines matter to the CEO this week? What is she paying attention to? Your Thursday night programming might be an in-depth interview with a customer because I need to understand what my customer cares about, what's keeping them up at night, what are the things they think about. And so as you start to think about your podcast as it's never just a podcast, it is one of those vehicles where you can play with formats and conversations and still not lose the heartbeat of what it's supposed to be. And so that's the other thing is like, it is one of those places that you can be the most creative, the most experiential, because it's such a forgiving space. So just thinking about it like that too is sometimes helpful. The other thing around success, and this is just kind of my framework of how I measure it. So for those that have a show, or have to report on a show, whatever, I've got kind of like a 3-question set that I will ask to see whether or not this thing is trending up and to the right, which is what people want to see, right? Like, is this doing what it's supposed to do? So the 3 questions I ask myself is, number 1 is, are we growing? And if you know things about podcasting, a download means nothing. A download is essentially the way that this was framed to me in a way that has clicked forever. It's kind of like a download is an RSVP to an event. It doesn't mean you're going to show up. The play, the listen, the consumption, that's the I showed up metric. And the podcasting space is kind of the wild, wild west when it comes to like definitions of things. And so I've tried to get really, really simple because it's hard to keep up. It's hard for me to keep up, and this is my job. You know what I mean? And it's like there's plays, there's listens, there's streams, there's views because YouTube is now a podcast directory. So it's like literally you're like, okay, so what do I look at to tell my leadership or tell myself that we're going up and to the right? So you ask yourself, are we growing? Month over month, are we growing? Are we growing? And that would be total reach. So if I am distributing my show on YouTube, then yeah, I need to see if those numbers are going up. If I'm cutting out clips of my show and putting it on LinkedIn, I need to see if our LinkedIn is actually growing because we're creating consistent content. So it is your total reach. Are we growing? I'll get there. No, that's good. But there's a different metric for that. Downloads, yes. I don't want to create confusion, but I'm going to say this for those if that's helpful. I just call it an impression because it's like, it really doesn't mean anything until I know how the content itself is performing. So are we growing? Total reach. Second question I'll ask myself is, how is our content performing? And that's what I would consider like our engagement metric. And how I determine how the content is performing is based on consumption, is based on time spent with brand. And there's only really two places that you can get that metric today, as it relates to podcasts specifically, and that's Apple Podcasts and Spotify. They will tell you time spent with brand. And it is crazy, the metrics that you see here. So just imagine this. You release one episode a month, and in that month, you generate 1,200 hours of time spent with brand. That just like hits a little bit different. You create one thing that's 45 minutes, and it equaled 1,200 minutes spent with your brand because of people showing up to the party and actually listening to it, engaging with that content. That is a number that CXOs care about, because there's no other channel, there's no other medium that's giving you that insight. So just as a little moment there. But those are the two platforms that will primarily tell you that. And what you're looking there is, when people show up to the party, are they engaged? Are they hanging out? Are they leaving at 12:50, or are they leaving the minute I got on the microphone? That's kind of how you sort of see like how that's working. And then the last question I ask, to your point, is, are they taking the intended action? So if they RSVP'd, they showed up to the party and they hung out for the most of it. After the party, did they do what I asked them to do? That's your follower, that's your subscribe. That's your subscribe metric. You could also have an intended call to action as well. So let's say you have a webinar and you wanted to promote your webinar on your podcast as an ad. You would like to see if people actually RSVP'd as a result of that webinar ad. That would be a secondary intended action. But if you're just looking, I just need to know how my show is performing. Are we growing month over month? How is our content performing? Like, are they hanging out? Is it engaging? And then the third thing is, did they take the intended action? When it comes to metrics, the other kind of simple way that I think about it, that's the framework. How do we make decisions based on those results? That's the other question I ask myself. So there's kind of like a good way to think about this. So one is, if your downloads, your impressions, your total reach is up and it's like popping, but your consumption sucks, like less than 50%, or your time spent with brand is like nothing, you might have, there's kind of one or two problems you're facing. One is your content sucks. Like editorially, they show up and they're like, I'm out of here. Or you're marketing it to the wrong audience. So that's kind of a way for you to go, what's happening? You know what I mean? On the other side, if your downloads are plateauing or just kind of trickling in, again, that's your total reach. I'm saying downloads after I told you not to say downloads, but you get what I'm saying. So if that's kind of like just trickling or plateauing, but your consumption is like 70% consistently, 90%, your content is awesome. Your people are showing up for you. More people need to know about it. So you've got yourself an opportunity to market differently. And that's when you can think about kind of the growth strategies, right? Of like, how do I get more people aware of my show? And then the last one is like subscribe, follower. I'll be really honest with you. Subscribe and follower matters because I want to see that they're converting to do something with me later. But if we're talking about podcasts specifically, the data is like, just because you're listening to something doesn't mean you subscribe to it, even if you're consistently going back and listening to it. So I wouldn't put all my stock in that conversion event. I would, however, if I'm thinking about this as like a business strategy, is I would go, what is like one or two things that I want to start converting people to do that makes this more of an owned opportunity? So like an email list, for example. Those are the kinds of things I would be asking myself. I do want to see my downloads and my subscribers kind of close together because it just helps me understand like what's real and what's not real, but I wouldn't put all my stock in the followers and subscribers. So your host platform is where you host your podcast feed, creates an RSS feed. Your host platform serves as your aggregate. So it will take everything from all the podcast directories that you're on, but it doesn't always include YouTube. So if you're hosting your podcast, if you're distributing your podcast also on YouTube, which you should, you will have to go grab that data to find out. Your host is your aggregate, but your host doesn't tell the full story. It just gives you a vibe, because what your host platform won't do is it won't tell you time spent with brand on Apple Podcast. It won't give you your consumption rate. So there's a lot of the annoying parts of piecing together the whole story. But if you just need a gut check of like, are we going up? Your host will give you that. Well, my answer is gonna be really biased, and I'll tell you why it's biased. We use Transistor because I have an agency, and it's the cheapest way to do it. If I were just like doing it for myself, I honestly would probably use Spotify's legit because the analytics, or I always liked Libsyn, and I'm like a loyal gal, so I'm like, they've been around forever. They're like an OG, and they give such their support is like, they respond so quickly. So we have clients in Transistor and in Libsyn, and Transistor because of a financial decision for the company. And I would use somebody who is IAB compliant, and I don't even know what that means at the top of my head anymore. But it's essentially like they're validating that your downloads are legit. And there's been a push around some of the compliancy around that because you had people like hacking the system and doing stupid stuff. Like, you remember how like back in the day you could buy, you probably can't, but like on Fiverr you could buy like followers on LinkedIn or on Instagram, and you'd be like, all of a sudden I have like 5,000. Similar stuff has happened, and they've really cracked down on it. So like we've had clients who had like 100,000 downloads a month, and it went to like 15. We were like, oh shit, because there was only 15 that were real. You know what I mean? So it's like they are cracking down on some of that stuff. So I would choose an IAB. Libsyn, Libsyn. Yeah. And I mean, these are like less than $50 a month kind of thing. Transistor, you can have multiple shows for $50 a month. So your point of view. So when you're starting to craft your show, one of the issues that we run into is like making a decision. Like, what should I talk about? What's the thing that helps me stand out? Like, I don't know what to say. I give a really good example of somebody who literally just leaned into her sort of blank spot of just going, or blind spot, and she created a show to fill that gap of what she didn't know. But the other thing you can think about is like the way I frame it, and I didn't frame it up here for some reason, but the question I ask myself is like, what do I want people saying about my brand online? What do I want people saying back to me about us? And so you can kind of work backward that way to determine the type of content that you want to create. So like, I want people saying that we know healthcare. I want people saying that we understand how to hire engineers. So it's like kind of like kind of back to the beginning of what I said is like, write the story you want to tell. Do the same thing here. Write the story you want people to say about you. And then that allows you to kind of get really clear on like the type of content, the type of topics, the type of guests that you want. One of the stories that you might say is like, I want people to think I'm friends with that person. That works too, because people buy from people, they don't buy from brands. And so if I want people to think that Tim and I are buddies, I want Tim on my show because people like Tim, and so they'll like me too. So it's that kind of idea. Yep. And then they'll be like, oh, they're friends. Sure we are. Gary Vaynerchuk, I always butcher his name. Does everybody know who that is? Gary V? A lot of people do. He had a really good analogy of like, when it comes to like podcasts specifically, it's like be the host of the party and like create FOMO for the people who weren't invited to the party. And so it's like part of his show strategy was just like get all the people that the cool kids think are cool on your podcast, and then it helps you then think that you're cool. So we can go back to high school for a minute. But that's one way if you need help shaping your point of view. And then the other thing is just like I always go back to the why of like, if I want people saying that we know how to hire engineers, why? Oh, because we solve that actual problem, or because I have engineers that need to get hired. Like, so just going through that thought process is beneficial. Okay, other question. Who's listening? This is First Principles Marketing. If you make it for no one will know about it, no one will listen, no one will care. So this kind of breaks even down to your question a little bit even more, but it's like, who do you want listening to your show? And there's kind of two different audiences when it comes to your podcast. One of them is you can decide if it's part of it or not, but you have two. If you have an interview-based show or a show that allows for a guest, that's an audience. You also have your listeners. They could be the same or they could be different. So keep that in mind. So for example, I might have a show that interviews CEOs, but I know a CEO isn't going to listen to the show. I really just want somebody who is serving the CEO to listen to this podcast. And so I'm not designing it for John, the CEO. I'm designing it for Sarah, the whatever. You know what I mean? So it's like you do have to think about that differently. And the other thing with that audience identification is like my guest experience is an extension of my brand experience. And so if I'm having CEOs come on my show and I want to work with CEOs, but the show is for somebody else, I still want to give that person a beautiful experience because it's a reflection of my brand. So when you think about your audience, you do need to think about it as two potential differences. And you might have primary, you might have secondary. So the thing I always ask is like, who are they? What keeps them up at night? Where do they currently engage on social? And that helps with my distribution strategy. And then topics, what do they care about? Literally, what do they care about? What keeps them up at night? What are the things that they're looking on the internet for? One of the things that has worked for us really recently is, you know how Google bought Reddit or Quora, one of them? You should be Googling and then looking at all the conversations in Reddit that are popping off as a way to like help you figure out what topics based on your niche. Also, the benefit of putting your show on YouTube is that YouTube is like the biggest search engine, and you can go in there to figure out what questions people are looking for, and then you can be the one answering those questions. So just some ways to like think about how you get more legs out of your investment. And truly, when I think about podcast content, yes, there's investment if you hire an agency or you hire somebody to do it or you're paying somebody internally to do it, but it's more of a time investment than anything. And so it's like, how do I maximize my time? These are some of the ways to kind of think through that. The last thing I'll say about topics, are we out of time? Oh, okay, great. The last thing I'll say about topics is is that your show, because it's never just a podcast, you can use your show as a vehicle to create, this is more for like marketing folks out here, but create like research reports or like key milestone type things. So you could take 12 episodes and then go, those 12 episodes are now a takeaway, an ebook, a white paper, whatever makes sense for your audience. So just again, thinking like big picture and then little picture as you go is really important. Yeah, so the way, there's kind of a rule of thumb, and then I'll give you a more of a like tactical whatever. So one is like, and this is not Rachel genius, this is just, I just told you everybody's point of view came from somebody else. But it's, the best shows are curious and brave. And so what I mean, curious and brave. And so what I mean by that is if a host doesn't care about the topic or they're not having fun, you know, and the show is boring because they're just checking the box because they're like, oh, this was a show that I get to interview somebody who might buy from me. By the way, people know if you're doing something else, even if you're in a meeting with them. Just as a quick soapbox moment. But staying curious. And so the minute that if you're the host, take the narrative around that you're boring, but if in your head you're like, I'm bored, I would go, what would make this not boring for me? What are the topics? What are the questions? What am I actually curious about? That's like a really good frame for you as you start to decide, like, how do I love this thing again? Kind of vibes. And then the other thing I say is brave, because a lot of times, even on like podcasts and things like that, people take 25 minutes to ask the actual question that they want to ask. And they give a whole preamble. And it's like, just ask the question. And so it's like being brave is like, is just like getting after the thing that you actually want to understand. Plus it's brave to get on a mic. The last thing I'll say that's like more of like a takeaway to think about is like, ask yourself, how do you want my audience to feel when they're done listening? Do I want them to feel like I'm knowledgeable? Do I want them to feel like they're understood? Do I want them to feel like scared? Do I want them to feel happy? Like having that feeling question answered also helps you determine who your host is, how you position the host, how you position the copy, the questions you ask, yada, yada. Is that helpful? Cool. The last thing I'll say about that is this is again, this is like if actually you could do this weekend if you watch a movie or tonight or whatever. But if you look at like the best movies ever made, there's two things that are happening in every single scene. And you can take the same principle and apply it to a single episode. But there's two things that are happening in every single scene of any great story ever told. And it's this tension between empowerment and function. So if you think about your episode and your show, it's like, what am I doing to empower my listener? And then functionally, what can they like take away? What's the loop that I can close for them? So just like thinking of that of like a rule of thumb of like, how am I empowering and how am I closing the loop by giving them something functional, something tangible? Okay, this is more, I might skip through some of this stuff, but this is more of like an example of like when we talked about how do you get the most out of the asset that you're creating, which is a podcast. We've sort of broken it into like 4 key pillars. And it's like you get your production stuff, which is what we talked about all day, your podcast, your video, your title, your show notes, your YouTube. Micro content, so what are the channels I'm distributing it for? And I gave a couple examples here. And then activation, like who are the people that I need to activate this content that might make me repurpose it differently for them? And then you get some of these extras that just come from the goodness of creating a podcast, which is like the thing that can go on your website, a transcription, unproduced clips, things like that. So just as you start to like identify whether podcasting is right for you or how you do it better or maximize it more, this is an example of what you could actually get out of one singular episode. That also, by the way, helps you get that buy-in on creating a podcast. Because you're like, I'm creating content no matter what. If I start from this source, I can get all this other stuff from it. I'll talk about this for 2 seconds and then I'll just see if you guys have questions, honestly. The last thing I'll say when you're thinking about your 6 questions of like, what do I need to ask myself to make sure I've thought this thing well enough through to keep it moving. This last question is your show's superpower. Your show's superpower is how you anchor back on making decisions. So kind of to your point a little bit earlier of like, how do I know what to say yes to, what to do, et cetera. I'll define these really quickly, but ultimately all 4 of these things are at play for your show at all times. You just get to choose which one's most important for where you're at with your show. So number 1 is the premise. Premise equals promise. What is the promise that I'm making to my audience about their experience? If I am listening to a true crime podcast and all of a sudden the episode that plays is about puppy dogs and training them, I'm gonna be like, you just let me down on the promise here. A talent-led show is the Joe Rogan Experience. It's actually a really good example. Like him or no, I don't care. Joe Rogan Experience, if he goes away, the show doesn't exist. For a brand, your talent could be the quality of guests that you have, but it could also be the host that you have. So if you're like, I need my CEO to be everywhere, that might be a talent-led show because you're leaning into that person's talent. Format-driven show, is everyone familiar with the Hot Ones show? That's a format-driven show. Take the spicy chicken wings away and the spicy questions as it gets spicier. It's just an interview show and they're messy. So it's a format-driven show. And then a community-driven show, the way I think about that is it's less about me and my guests. It's more about what am I doing on my show to create connection for the people listening. So it's like community of listeners. That format is usually really good for people who already have a community and they're looking to get like more interim connection and engagement and things like that. Or it's for people who, like we have a client who does truck driving and are like, we want more truck drivers talking to each other. Well, they should have a community-led show. So as you think about your show superpowers, all 4 are at play all the time. I would just say pick your primary because it allows you to make some creative decisions. So with that, I think we're getting real close here on time. I threw this slide together if you're just getting started, but does anybody have any like questions that they would love to answer or ideas or comments? The way that I think about it is like really getting clear on like what you don't want to do and what you need other people to help you do. And so there's like one is like, do you actually need a producer? And like a producer is somebody who's going to help curate the content to help you tell a story. They're going to be in the content with you. I think the best shows have more content marketers turn producer, but I'm obviously biased. So do you need that? Do you need somebody that can just do the post-production, like the administration, but maybe the editing too, the scheduling, that because you just don't want to mess with it. So kind of just figuring out where you're at. Like we have some clients who are like, look, my IP is my business. And so you're never going to know my IP. So please don't try and help me. So it's like they wouldn't hire us end to end because we can't do that for them. Yeah, so Fiverr's a fine resource, but you just have to know that you are the producer. So you have to know that you're checking for mistakes. You have to know that you're telling them exactly what you want done. You have to be very explicit. You have to give examples. It's like, do you want to do that, or you just want to do it yourself, or do you want to hire somebody who's going to be that for you? The other thing I would say with that is, like, speaking of AI, AI can help a lot, but I have not seen yet that they can do editing well. So like the actual editing of the stuff with like the audio and the video, it's not there yet. And so if there's like bar none, like I don't have a big marketing budget to spend on this. I just need this to be a show that I consistently produce. Maybe just get an editor. You know what I mean? And you're going to spend 50 to $500. It just depends on like how much video work you want. Yeah, all that kind of stuff. Okay. Well, I'm around if you have more you think of. Like we talked about at the beginning, Launch does have a studio in there. Love to be able to help you maximize it and use it. If you have questions, I'm based out of here, and you can find me online if you so desire. That is my email. Thanks for hanging out with us.